Well, up next, we have a treat for you. We're going to hear from one of the smartest guys in startups, Keith Rabois. Keith has
I'm
established
Robert Hackett. I'm a senior writer.
Biggest brands in tech, including PayPal, LinkedIn, and Square. And he's going to be sharing his experiences with us on disrupting industries and building brands, and also what he sees as the future for Stellar. Robert Hackett from Fortune, who writes about all things crypto, will be moderating this discussion. I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, Meridian. I'm Robert Hackett. I'm a senior writer at Fortune, and I am here with Keith Rabois, who has had a hand in some of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley over his many years in the industry. Keith, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure to be with you and be with everybody.
So let's kick things off. I want to ask you something about kind of the way that you have framed yourself just through your entire career as being both conservative and yet also contrarian. I'm wondering how you square those things. They seem like they could be oxymoronic in a way.
There is some, I admit there's some oxymoronic nature to being a conservative and contrarian, because by definition, a conservative takes advantage of and believes in principles from the past and wants to apply them into the future. And so to some extent, being contrarian is reinventing things and thinking first principles, what doesn't work, and trying to innovate, really. That said, in the modern Silicon Valley monoculture, being conservative and contrarian is probably a Venn diagram overlap there of the two concepts, because most people here are not conservative and most people are not that contrarian. So in any event, there's probably, you're right, there's an inherent intellectual sort of contradiction there, but it also is apt for where I feel like I am today in the last 10 years in Silicon Valley, let's say.
So you've been involved in some of the biggest companies, like I said, from PayPal to LinkedIn to Yelp, Google, Square, the list goes on and on. I'm wondering what you've learned in your experiences about how to bring a company from sort of its earliest, smallest stages up to, real success.
Well, I mean, I wasn't really involved in Google. I think I worked there 2 weeks after I got acquired and quit. Putting that aside, the most important thing is the people. Really, at the end of the day, the people drive everything. So in Silicon Valley, you can easily get distracted with technology, products, fancy intellectual analysis of all these markets. At the end of the day, it's the team you build, it's the company you build. And so what I've learned is the only thing to worry about is, do I have the right people in the right opportunities, in the right seats, so to speak. Basically, if you think of baseball metaphor, the right people playing in the right positions. And if that is true, then everything's going to work out. And if that's not true, it's very difficult to make things succeed. So I focus from the day I get involved in a company, from the day I meet a founder, to do they have the right team for the problems they're seeking to solve.
What do you look for in a founder, in a person? What are the sorts of attributes that define a successful entrepreneur or just, business person, tech?
Sure, I think there are
pioneer?
two elements. One is very specific to the particular opportunity. So if one wanted to build space apps, there are different skill sets than building photo sharing apps to compete with, let's say, Instagram. But there are some general traits that apply to entrepreneurial endeavors. I think tenacity is first. You can define it as relentlessly resourcefulness, which Paul Graham wrote a great blog post about. So a little bit better, maybe more accurate than tenacity, but they're roughly similar. There's also a book by Duckworth, who's on grit, which is also a similar concept. So something in that category is pretty important and fundamental. Second thing, I actually believe in IQ. At the end of the day, you're trying to solve problems that other people haven't been able to solve and see things that other people haven't been able to see. And that typically is a function of IQ. And then third is the ability to assess people. As I mentioned, basically you're building a team. And team building requires you to be able to accurately diagnose the skills and the opportunity and the growth curve, really, of the potential people you meet as you interview them, as you recruit them, and as you have them in your organization, and move them around into opportunities where they can really thrive and succeed. Those three things together are usually magical.
So, I mean, the pandemic has had a big effect on everything in the world at this point. How has it affected your job, your ability to do your job, and maybe even what you're looking at, the theses you might have, how you're evaluating entrepreneurs?
Yeah, COVID's been an interesting, in quotes, opportunity. So I'd say on the negative side, at Founders Fund, we're founders-driven investors. At the end of the day, the most important thing for us is the caliber and quality of founders. And I think in the Zoom investing world, or remote investing world, it's extremely difficult to gauge the quality of people that you don't already know. It's not that difficult to meet with and gauge people by Zoom that you already have some pre-existing relationship with, experience with, but it's extraordinarily difficult to, from a cold start, evaluate somebody, not just where they are today, but what their potential growth curve is. It's hard to do this in person, period, anyway. It's extraordinarily difficult to do this remotely. And so I've found that I feel like I'm at a comparative disadvantage vis-a-vis the few people I compete with. And as a firm, we may be at a comparative disadvantage in evaluating early stage opportunities as we've had to and relegated to Zoom-based investing. So I think that's just a negative, at least for me, for us. Now we'll see how long this persists, is this permanent or temporary? And nobody really knows the answer to that. It's mostly driven by healthcare. Second, though, has it shifted some of the opportunities? Yes. I think there's less inertia. One of the biggest challenges to starting a new company, particularly on the consumer side, but it's somewhat also true on enterprise, is inverting inertia. So people have 24 hours in a day, and they've already arranged those 24 hours around sleep, family, hobbies, jobs. And so anytime you launch something new, you have to reorient people's time. And that basically means replacing something. People forget about this all the time, that anytime you want me to adopt a new product, I have to get rid of something and drop something. And that behavior is pretty ingrained in my life usually. And what COVID has done is force people with a big stick. Basically, you're going to reinvent your time whether you like it or not. You're no longer going to movie theaters. You're no longer going to concerts. You're no longer going to restaurants. This, and this is just not happening. And so, well, I've got all this extra time and I'm kind of bored. So I might want to do something else at that time. So in some ways, it's easier to get traction with a new product right now in the last 6 to 9 months, because people have had to rethink their prioritization and time allocation. And typically they don't really want to rethink it. So I think that's been a healthy dynamic, and it's been easier to fund maybe innovative things on the consumer side.
Have you seen this across your portfolio? Have you seen an uptick in usage across all of your various investments?
Yes, I mean, some are obviously propelled by COVID. Think DoorDash. People couldn't go to restaurants, so of course they want food delivered. I mean, clear substitution. Not in my portfolio, although I wish it was. This is like Peloton. Obviously, there is some preference to going to real world classes, real world gyms, at least for a large fraction of America. Not really possible. So people have substituted massively to things like Peloton. We do have in our portfolio a company called Tempo, which is basically strength training at home with a class live instructor, kind of like Peloton strength training, and it's done phenomenally well. Not unexpected, propelled by the COVID world. But then there's another category of companies that aren't directly propelled by COVID, but are still thriving. So across the portfolio I work with, let's say 80% of the companies are better off than they were before COVID. And not because the market has made things better, it's because I think it's just better for technology-oriented companies to compete against inertia, to compete against incumbents in a remote world. And so therefore, this sounds kind of crazy and anomalous that 80% of our companies would be doing better, but it's factually true. I also think it was just also forced some discipline. Sometimes in a high growth company, people are lazy about making tough decisions because everything's kind of up and to the right. And so you sort of postpone making hard decisions or painful decisions. And when COVID sort of hit, everybody had to make very dramatic, very decisive decisions, bold. And it turns out that was a very healthy thing for the organization as a whole, teaching people that muscle, that ability, that confidence of, I can make trade-off decisions, I can prioritize things, ruthlessly. The companies as a whole just operate better, and that will lead to a better outcome for a huge swath of the companies.
So I've got to ask about this what's going on kind of like broadly in business right now. There's this renaissance going on with respect to fintech. There's quite a boom. PayPal is absolutely crushing it, and so is Square. Having been involved with both of those companies early on, I'm wondering how you're viewing this new sort of wave of fintech that's arriving. What's behind it?
Well, I mean, obviously the market caps of PayPal and Square are propelling a lot of investment. Just like looking at a 200 plus billion-dollar PayPal, a 70, $80 billion Square, a 40, $50 billion Audience, Shopify, which is moderately fintech at 100 billion plus. Obviously, investors and entrepreneurs react to examples, positive examples that they see, and they want to emulate that. Traditionally, we started back in PayPal in 2000. Everybody hated fintech. I don't even know if that's the right term, but they hated financial services meets technology. It was perceived to be a boring, sleepy, low margin, difficult business. It's still a difficult business. I think all the other things may be false. I actually think Square helped propel this, the sex appeal of the company. I think financial services was considered boring, dry. A lot of entrepreneurs substitute to things that are fascinating, interesting, kind of a shiny object. And Square sort of made payments cool with design and a bunch of design-driven principles, and just had a very, very different approach. And I think when Square started working, it was perceived to be working among entrepreneurs and investors. It opened up people's eyes to there was a lot more there. I remember when I joined Square and decided to join Square in the summer of 2010. It was really controversial among my friends when I sort of made a commitment. There's a lot of my friends have a stereotypic caricature image of financial services. Like, why are you doing that? Why are you going back to that? Like, this is, wasn't PayPal really bad and difficult and boring and all this stuff? And it almost got to me, truthfully. It's like literally like half my friends. Now I think if you join a company like that, maybe 1%, 85% of your friends would have those views, but it'd be very popular, maybe too popular. You can argue that if anything, it's become too consensus to invest in fintech, although we're certainly doing more of it.
I've also noticed that some of these companies have recently made some signals that are kind of bullish when it comes to cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. PayPal having added the ability, saying they're going to add it for Venmo next year. Square actually investing in it, $50 million. And the sort of broader macroeconomic world, I mean, Bitcoin's been taking off. It's gone up above 10,000. Today, when we're filming this, which is not when it's going to be, it's going to be up before or after we've actually done this, but today it was at 15,000, which was quite a signal. I'm wondering what you think about cryptocurrency, whether your opinions about it have changed, whether you're more bullish or bearish. How does a contrarian kind of play cryptocurrency at this point in the game?
It is a very good question. I mean, I'd say from a founder's fund perspective, we're pretty bullish on Bitcoin. We made the decision years ago to buy Bitcoin directly, and continue to somewhat do that. We are looking at alternative crypto investments, but there is some degree of consensus, sort of emerging around crypto now and again. And so it's hard to be contrarian as the price keeps going up. There may be things orthogonal to Bitcoin's price that might be interesting in crypto again. And then, we certainly look to fund those. But it was easier to be sort of contrarian when crypto was crashing. Now there's, I think it's somewhat a function of the macro environment. There's perceived, inflation forthcoming. There's certainly the governments of the world printing money. There's some potential hedge against volatility and government intrusion in people's lives. And so there's a lot of macro developments that are probably propelling some investment in crypto at the moment.
Are you planning to make more bets in that world, or are you sort of sitting back and just waiting and seeing what's going to happen?
I suspect we'll make more bets, but I mean, at the end of the day, as an investor, you're typically reactive to what entrepreneurs want to do. So 95% of the time, we're really funding things that entrepreneurs have decided they want to pursue, and we're giving them fuel, rocket fuel, oxygen, to propel them to chase their vision. Very rarely, not never, but very rarely are we actually top-down, deriving a vision of what should happen and then, kind of creating it. We do that. We did that with Anduril, which has done very well at Founders Fund. I did that previously with Open Door, and we're funding a new internal project right now in a very high-tech, deep tech space. So we can do that, but it's once every 3 to 5 years. The meat and potatoes of what we do is other people on the planet who have talent and ambition come to us and ask for support. So really, it's a function of what are the top tier entrepreneurs and proto entrepreneurs want to do with their time, and are they finding interesting, fascinating things to do with crypto?
Have you detected any themes or patterns as to what the most interesting and technically talented people are interested in right now at this moment?
Not necessarily patterns, because I think it's pretty fragmented. I think we see innovation and interest in healthcare, not surprisingly, given the headlines you read about. You know, if anything, COVID has certainly exposed both the opportunities and weaknesses in our current healthcare system. So entrepreneurs are definitely interested in that. Definitely see a development over the last 2 or 3 years that's novel, interest in climate change and creating innovation that would help address climate change, not government regulation, but like bottoms up innovation, like technology, software, et cetera. So that's become pretty common to see. You do absolutely see a lot of financial services, innovation and versions of the same, sort of taking advantage of what lessons they can glean from successful companies, applying it in new verticals or new opportunities. Autonomous driving, there's still interest there, figuring that out. I mean, obviously 40,000 Americans die somewhat unnecessarily every year in auto accidents. There's a lot of other benefits to autonomous driving, but safety and life preservation is one of them. So we see that, but we don't really, there's probably a fair amount of innovation in mental health, different versions of mental health, not just talk to a psychiatrist, psychologist kind of version of mental health, but, and certainly 2020 has been challenging for many people's mental health, from almost every possible dimension. So there's more interest there. I'd say those are probably the biggest obvious deltas from maybe 5 years ago.
You've been in San Francisco for a while now. Are you going to stay there? There's been a lot of talk of flight out of cities with the pandemic. What are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I've lived in the Bay Area since 2000. I moved out here to join PayPal. And I've lived in San Francisco since 2003. So right after we sold the company to eBay, I moved up to the city. So 17 years. I'm planning to leave San Francisco. I think San Francisco is just so massively improperly run and managed that it's made it impossible to stay here. I've surveyed most of the CEOs I work with just to start a Zoom call on a one-on-one. I basically asked them what fraction of their close colleagues and friends are in San Francisco. And in the last 2 conversations I've had, one CEO told me that he's married, so 4 of their 7 as a couple's closest friends have already left the Bay Area. And then one other CEO told me of his 20 closest friends, only 6 are still in the Bay Area. So I think that's actually what's going on under the radar. COVID sort of masked this because it's not quite as obvious where people are moving to, and if they've actually moved, everybody's working remotely. But yeah, we're moving imminently outside California.
Would you have done this if it weren't for the pandemic?
Probably not. I think that the pandemic had an interesting couple of facts. One is, I think there was a perceived handicap or handcuffs on moving outside of California that may in fact be more psychological than real. And I think what COVID and quarantine and work remote has done is expose that they may be more psychological handicaps and constraints than metaphysical ones. And I don't know if any of us would have had enough sort of conviction around that prior to working remotely at scale and just watching. Secondly, because of the rules associated with lockdowns, especially in San Francisco and California, you're effectively not getting any of the benefits of an urban environment, and you're getting all the downsides of not being in suburbia. So, the reasons why people gravitate towards a city is typically like social density, bars, restaurants, think of all the vibrancy that you get in the city. And COVID and quarantine rules have basically eliminated that. So all you get are the downsides, which is less space, less outdoor space, all the negatives, but none of the upsides. So I think a lot of people have shifted. If I'm going to live in a suburban lifestyle because I have to for healthcare reasons, I might as well get the benefits of suburbia, more space, outdoor space, et cetera. And so I think that's what's led to a lot of the substitution away from San Francisco.
Now, given your work with Open Door, real estate startup, Are you seeing these trends broadly? Is this something that is this actually a trend that's happening, or is it something that people are just kind of hand-wringing about the death of cities?
Well, people are buying and selling houses at real scale right now. People are shifting their preferences of where they want to live, which is leading to the velocity of sale. So you can see this in Zillow data, Redfin data, Opendoor data. All this is public. That's why Zillow is trading at a significant premium over the last year. Redfin's 3x its market cap in the last 18 months. It's all propelled by people relocating. As people change their preferences, obviously they dispose of their current place and buy new ones. And so Opendoor is in the business of buying and selling houses, so obviously that helps Opendoor. But we absolutely see the preference changes. You see the rents. Rents are actually faster feedback loops than real estate for a variety of reasons. And the Bay Area, in San Francisco particularly, rents are in free fall. They're down like 30% year to year. We're probably going to hit the lowest, sort of rental, average rental price in San Francisco in over a decade in October. And this is still masked by things like concessions that don't make it price transparent. You're seeing this in New York City too, by the way. Rents in New York are also in free fall. So there's clear substitution going on in people's preferences. How durable it is another question. Do people move somewhere in 2021, 2022, and then realize their trade-offs and want to move back to dense urban city? Maybe, but that'll take some time to sort out. But it's very clear right now that people are shifting their preferences pretty massively.
Where are you headed?
I'm going to Florida.
And what went behind that decision?
Well, Florida is a very well-run state. Miami is an incredibly beautiful city, cosmopolitan, has an interesting mix of New Yorkers, Latin Americans, and Europeans. It's a very pro-business state and city. Like, for example, there's no state income tax, and they seem to run their city pretty well. There's very limited traffic, which is nice. Also living in the Bay Area for 20 years. It's just like all the things you wish you had in the Bay Area. I'm a fan of warm weather and water, so it feels like I'm going on vacation.
That sounds nice. Let's talk a little bit about this turn that's happened in politics against big tech. There was the House antitrust report put out. Now the DOJ is suing Google. Recently, they said they're going to try to block the Plaid acquisition by Visa. And of course, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook are in everybody's sights as well. Should these companies be broken up?
Well, most of them, no. I think, most of these companies are not by any definition a monopoly. I think you can make a certain case that Google's got a monopoly power in a relevant market. Pretty easy to see Visa as a duopoly, notwithstanding the innovation all around financial services. I think from a market share perspective, it wouldn't be that controversial to show that Visa's got significant market power. And so I think the Google and to some extent the DOJ case against Visa, which was announced this morning, make a lot of sense. I think everything else is, you're basically torturing antitrust principles to try to achieve other objectives, and that doesn't make any sense to me. I think, for example, there's a lot of people on the left that really don't like big technology companies, whether for good or bad reasons. I think some of it's purely like sort of fake news from 2016. And, with Biden winning, most likely, I think all of a sudden the left's critiques of big tech are going to be a lot less because there won't be an election result to blame. And then the conservative.
By the way, filming this before the election result, just to clarify.
Yeah, so I suspect that Biden ultimately is president of the United States, barring a couple subtle changes, which could happen, but like more likely than not by a lot. But on the right, you're also seeing a lot of animosity towards technology companies because they are censoring conservative opinions in a disproportionate way. And at some point, the Republicans and the conservatives are not going to tolerate large companies being advocates for the Democratic Party of the United States. Like, that's just a non-starter. Any Fortune 500 company knows that. Like, if you look at how financial services companies in New York have acted, they know that they cannot be a partisan arm. And technology companies are going to learn the hard way that if Twitter particularly is acting as an ally of the Democratic Party, eventually Republicans are going to figure out what to do about that. And I don't think antitrust law is the right solution. There's plenty of other ways to stop Twitter from suppressing conservative opinions.
You mentioned this, that there is maybe some bias coming out of the way that these companies are doing content and conspiracy theories.
They may argue that, but when you allow misinformation from the left and you suppress it from the right, or you allow misinformation from China, but don't allow it from President Trump, or you allow it from Iran, but not from some Republican press secretary, you obviously have bias. There's just no way you can justify the CCP proselytizing propaganda and suppressing the New York Post.
What are you being a contrarian, and also about this sort of problem of big tech maybe censoring information? I wonder what your information diet is like.
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, I'm kind of old school, and maybe it's a function of my age, but I actually like to read books. I read long-form books, and that's how I find interesting new ideas, new data, because most people aren't actually reading these books. And so if you read the same information diet as other people, you're going to have effectively the same views usually, and or at least a distribution curve around them. So I like to go back to original source materials, read books, and find new things to think about. And the good news is books don't get censored nearly as much, which is ironic because to me, the solution of content moderation, disinformation is actually pretty trivially easy. We've had laws around defamation and libel and porn, obscenity for centuries. Works fine. We have publishing industries all across the world that work fine. And so I don't see why Twitter, Facebook, anybody else, Google should be innovating. If a piece of content can be published in a book, it should absolutely be publishable on Twitter.
What are you reading now? Anything good? Anything you'd recommend?
Yeah, I unfortunately have books all around the house. So it depends on your interest. In the business world, I'm reading, a combination. One book I'd recommend for people who haven't read it, I'm a big fan of, it's on the bookshelf right behind me. It's called Moonshots. It's about how to optimize a current business while propelling innovation at the same time throughout the history of technology. Highly, highly recommend that one. From a completely orthogonal perspective, I'm reading a book about breathing, which may sound boring and dumb, but it's about how you breathe, whether you breathe through your nose or mouth, affects everything about your life, like your immunity to your happiness. It's incredibly provocative, extremely well researched, and actually quite well written. It's not my standard cup of tea. I don't usually read books like this, but it's fascinating. I already catch myself at night, trying to force myself to breathe more through my nose. It's been that effective in changing my behavior. And then from a policy perspective, there's actually a great new book written about COVID that I highly recommend. Something Paradox, I'm forgetting the title, but just published. It's really good, and it's very timely, obviously, informative, timely, provocative, rigorously researched. And then from a politics perspective, I'm usually reading a biography or so, like something. I have a couple right now that I'm halfway through. There's a new Churchill one I really like, which is actually really difficult to do, write something new and novel about Churchill. There's a new one, brand new one about James Baker, who just starting, and I think will be fascinating. And then there's one about the rise of Ronald Reagan in 1976, actually, which I find truly fascinating. The world's history could have been very, very different with a couple of little delta changes. It's amazing, as you grow up, and actually 2020 is proving this as well, little small changes that were not preordained, how they affect human history, pretty magical. And so the rise of Reagan in 76 is pretty fascinating because it did propel probably 30, 40 years of intellectual discourse changes in the US and the UK particularly, but then it affected globally through the Soviet Union's collapse, et cetera. So I find that one pretty good as well. It's based on a name, but Richard Perlman's the author.
Excellent. You've got a wide-ranging variety of interests there. I'm quite interested in that Breathe book. I'm going to be taking some deep breaths.
On Twitter. So one thing, if people want my reading list, what I've decided to do is, if you go to my media tab, I basically screenshot books I'm reading. And so if you just go to the media tab, they don't, unfortunately, Twitter doesn't have a feature where you can relabel it, I just call it books. But if you go to my media tab, 90% of what you're going to see will be books.
That's fantastic. We'll be checking out your library. And very quickly, just before we sign off, I'd love to ask you, what is the most overhyped thing right now? What's everybody into that you think is just not gonna pan out?
You know, to some extent, I've had this view for 5, 10 years. I still am not the biggest fan of VR. And I think like reality is, if in a COVID world where everybody's locked in their house, you can't really get VR to be mainstream. I think that's sort of proof right there. Like, you know, in the real world, when we're back to normal at some point, hopefully, there's so many distractions and so many benefits of real world experiences versus VR. But with 6 months of people literally being locked at home and you can't propel VR, I think that's a pretty big indictment.
I think with the rise of Zoom, that is a truly contrarian take, that VR isn't going to be as big as people think it might be. But Keith, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for telling us all of your wide-ranging opinions on so many subjects. And have a good move to Miami.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meridian, for joining us.